is the Downtown Bucksport Coastal Resiliency Master Plan public meeting. It's Tuesday, October 22nd. This meeting will be held in person, obviously, and it can be viewed on local cable channel 1303 or on the internet by accessing bucksportmaine.gov, selecting agendas and minutes, and choosing this meeting and clicking on the video button next to the meeting. Questions or comments may be submitted prior to or during this meeting by emailing rich.rotella@bucksportmaine.gov or during the meeting by calling 207-307-8030. And I will turn this over to Travis from GEI.
Great, thanks everybody for coming out to the meeting and for viewing online. We're going to give a draft presentation of some of our initial concepts that we're recommending for coastal resiliency improvements to downtown waterfront. These largely based on a great amount of public input that we've received either through our online survey or at our previous workshop meeting, as well as from the committee. I have a brief agenda here that we're going to go over. John, if you want to forward the slide. We're going to do brief introductions, again, to introduce you to the town's representatives as well as our team that's working on the project. Give a brief project overview, similar to what we did at the last meeting, talking about why and how we got here, what we've heard so far from the public, a little bit about our existing conditions assessment of what we're seeing down at your waterfront. Then we'll do a draft overview of the master plan and open it up for some public comments tonight. As Rich mentioned, folks online can also, I believe, call in with questions. And then we'll talk a little bit about next steps as it's anticipated to include this concept planning phase by the end of December. Okay, so real briefly, my name is Travis Pryor. I'm the project manager involved with this effort. I worked with the town initially on an existing conditions assessment of your shorefront a couple of years ago in light of some of the coastal storms and erosion that you were seeing along your waterfront.
My name is John Garreau with GEI Consultants, engineer supporting the concept designs for the improvements here.
And I'm Rich Rotella, Community and Economic Development Director. I'm in charge of the SHIP grant that has provided us this opportunity to have this draft master plan.
Jay?
Jay Lanfer, I'm Director of Public Works here in town.
Mike Wormsby, Harbor Master and Marina Manager.
We also have Mark Eastman, who's been participating as a town councilor, who's not here tonight, as well as Luke, who is your codes enforcement officer. Right, so the project area that we're defining as the downtown waterfront is generally along the length of the waterfront walkway from Steamboat Wharf Lane out to where the walkway ties back into Main Street, just beyond the Irving and Circle K building. And it's anywhere from Main Street, generally looking down to the Penobscot River along the shoreline. Some of the goals and objectives that were initiated this master planning effort was to develop an overall kind of comprehensive study looking at the entire downtown waterfront and not just at shorefront improvements, the shorefront stabilization, which is one piece that needs to happen down there. But while you're at it, what are some of your long-term plans potentially that should be coordinated for improvements to your town pier, to the walkway, to the marina facilities, and so on. So we're developing a concept level overall master plan that suggests coordination with a variety of things that could happen down there to make it more resilient to potential future flood risk scenarios and increased precipitation events. One of the primary goals as well in terms of that study topic is to make sure that the plan is well endorsed and supported by the community and based on the community's values and input and goals for improvements down at the waterfront. To make sure that it considers both immediate and near-term needs for improvements down there as well as long-term ones. Oftentimes when you're doing public infrastructure improvements to an area like this, you could be looking at hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in improvements, and you want to make sure that they're projected to last for a long time. So we do look at some of the climate risk factors a little further out than over the next 25 years or so, all the way through 50 or 75 years for the normal life expectancy of the infrastructure we're proposing. The project is supported by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who provides federal funding through the Maine Coastal Program for studies of this nature. And they do have some program goals about making sure the master plan considers the Maine Climate Council's recent study in their climate action plan, which has some commit to manage levels in consideration of relative sea level rise, and I'll talk about those again a little bit, and then some prepare to manage levels. Those look at a variety of potential computer modeled scenarios for different coastal flood risks into the future. We conducted an existing conditions assessment, not only with the shorefront stabilization work in 2022, but also at the start of this project. We know there's a long history of coastal activity within the Penobscot River and along your waterfront. So we looked at some of that, looked at recognizing the overall area as a really valuable, one of the top recognized valuable assets to the community as a whole. It provides a variety of economic value to the community as well as public interest in terms of recreation, active walking, viewing, and so on, and a strong sense of community value in terms of preserving it based on the longstanding history of use in the area. There are a variety of infrastructure in your waterfront as well as conditions that you've experienced in terms of environmental impacts, especially of late with the 2022 and then 23, 24 winter storm events. For the most part, fortunately, we've seen that a lot of your shorefront in terms of the rock armoring and your facilities that are there have held up pretty well. It's a relatively static flood inundation that we've seen versus a lot of higher wave energy or storm surge like you might see on the outer coast. What has been impacted, though, is some kind of close calls, if you will. This is the fishing pier, and your town pier experienced kind of similar level of flooding and held up pretty well. At the town pier, you had some floats that were temporarily stored over the winter, and those floated and fortunately just landed next door in the intertidal zone during this past winter. And then you frequently have a lot of issues going on with your walkway, which is right at the edge of the shoreline in a lot of area, and those unit paver bricks tend to get dislodged, and I think through volunteer efforts you tend to reset those, from what we heard, tens if not dozens of times a year in certain isolated areas. And then this area occurred, I think, with some upland runoff near the Irving Station, where you can see some channelized erosion that occurred, and that impacted the walkways and drainage down, stormwater drainage down to the shoreline. That's been repaired since then, but this is an elevated risk that, as we experience potentially increased intensity of rainfall events and higher frequency, some of the systems, like what's being redesigned or has been reconstructed in Main Street by Maine Department of Transportation, looks at upgrading some of their storm drainage facilities to accommodate those potential higher storm events, and we recommend that you continue to do that. We did present a lot of the kind of scientific information around some of your coastal flood risk issues that you're experiencing here, so I'm not going to go into those in detail in the presentation. We're happy to talk about that again. Some of the questions came up about sea level rise, and people saying, I haven't really seen much change over the last so many years, or what are the rates historically, last 100 years, maybe last 20 years. The last 100 years, based on at least the tidal gauge out in Bar Harbor, is the most relevant local one to look at. They have decent data going back to 1950 through today, and from about 1950 to 2000 for Portland Station or Eastports or Bar Harbors, or a lot of them in the Northeast, the rate of change for sea level rise over a decade was about 0.7 inches. So, you know, over 3 or 4 decades, if you're looking at your waterfront and it may have gone up an inch or 2 or 3, that's something that a lot of folks don't always notice, that level of detail. And then over the last 20 years, it's increased to about 1.4 inches per decade. Still not a lot that folks have seen in terms of just static sea level rise over time. A lot of the predicted models and what the Climate Council is looking at by the next 25 years or next 75 years are a significant increase in sea level rise, where you might see a foot or 2 of rise or several inches of rise per decade at a much higher rate. A lot of that's assisted by honed scientific data over time, or better computer modeling to be able to crunch some of that. And wherever it ends up, it's always being refined. So based on whatever you guys decide to value your risks at, there are some increasing levels of attachments to local, state and federal funding requirements and potentially regulatory permitting requirements to start to meet those, what like the Maine Climate Council is calling a commit to manage level or prepare to manage level. So we have to plan for some of that if you're going to make these improvements and investments again for something that should last 75 or 100 years. We're not going to get too cute with which inch or a few inches that sea level rise may occur at, but we're going to make sure if you're going to invest tens of millions of dollars in improvement that it's at a conservative estimated level of sea level rise. Some of the big takeaway findings we found, and it was great to see evidence of them during last year's winter storms, which were close to a 100-year storm event, was that most of your waterfront is pretty stable and resilient to that type of event. Most of the impacts were to that kind of nuisance erosion of your unit paver walkway or the floats, being displaced, but that was an unusual event. And we think through 2050 with the projected sea level rise, when we talked about mean high water levels, which is your daily tide, that is lower down on the embankment. And even if you add some of the worst case projections of sea level rise, it's still not going to be impacting most of your waterfront on a daily basis. So it's more a matter of risk tolerance for what happened last winter happening again periodically. So we are recommending some lower level at grade solutions that are more resilient to flooding and adapted to that over the next 25 years. And then as you look out further over 100 years, that's where that 3 or 4 feet of predicted sea level rise with some of those storm events are going to start hitting some of your buildings a little bit more, or some of your utilities around your marina in particular, and at the restroom building. And so at that point, it takes a while to get a lot of the momentum and funding, permitting and design for a wall system, which we'll show an example of here in a moment. But we would recommend that you start planning for that, but from between 2050 to 2100 to make some more significant investments. For the public survey, we got what we thought was really good response versus some of the other studies we've done around the state. You had over 66 responses to the public input survey. I'll talk a little bit about the findings from that here. It was pretty unanimous that views and the walkability, basically your downtown waterfront, were two of the primary important items that people value throughout Bucksport's waterfront. And we started asking the question a little bit differently, what types of additions and or improvements would you like to see to your waterfront? Walking again was right at the top, and then opportunities for more parking and park space down on the west end near Steamboat Wharf Lane, similar to what you have up around the Veterans Memorial, was another item that folks would like to see. We talked a little bit about, have you experienced coastal flooding at the waterfronts? A little bit over 50% of folks said that they have experienced some level of impact from that. And then if coastal flooding in the downtown is a concern to you, please explain why. And most of the responses, again, were around the walkway. As it occurs, they want to make sure that access and erosion impacts are minimized in terms of keeping that waterfront walkway viable. Do you support local, state, or federal funding or regional funding? In this case, which could also be the federal, to support adapting and improving some of the resiliency of your downtown waterfront with these projects. And it wasn't 100% unanimous, but it was a pretty good level of support for investing in your downtown waterfront. What are 3 most important things in the downtown waterfront that you would like prioritized for protection? Again, the walkway was the top one by a lot, but then the next one below that was the town dock and marina area, and then next in line was at-risk buildings. We used the museum or the gazebo or the restroom building, some of those ones that kind of lightly get touched or right on the edge of getting flooded now, and may need to have some adaptive measures put in place in the future. We held a public workshop here in this meeting. So there were around 20 or so folks that showed up for that. We had a lot of good discussion at that and a lot of similar responses in terms of the views and the walkway being the primary assets that were valued by the public at that meeting. We heard a lot about if we're gonna make these revitalization improvements, that they should continue to prioritize protection of your waterfront from coastal risk, elevated risk scenarios. It was noted again that the overall waterfront provides a lot of value to the community in terms of a strong sense of community of what Bucksport is for businesses, residents, and for visitors. And again, the additional park and parking space down at the west end, if you will, down near Steamboat Wharf Lane, is a primary theme of importance. We're going to look at this a little bit now in terms of recommended improvements by 2050 and then recommended longer term improvements by 2100. The initial one is to replace that brick paver walkway with a paved walkway system that's more resilient and adaptive to being overtopped by periodic storms. Also to widen it to 10 feet width at a minimum, which will make it more plowable. A lot of demand for year-round access, and a 4-foot wide walkway, which is what you have an easement on a lot of your private properties now, is recommended to be widened to 10 feet for maintenance for year-round use, but that will require coordination with a lot of private property owners along the way. And you're showing an example of this, but you are limited with what you can do under the Route 1 bridge in terms of vertical clearance, and it's a highly vulnerable area. We have an example from another project in Lisbon, but we're recommending that area be replaced with unit pavers with a concrete walkway and with a concrete abutment, so for scour protection. And it's going to flood. It already floods now. It's going to flood in the future with sea level rise, but unless you elevate the bridge, you really can't elevate the walkway that much more in that area. So that's an area that you know has to be adaptable. Consider storing some of the items like your seasonal floats further upland as sea level rise increases over time. So start planning for an area to relocate that. I know it's very convenient, and you have the crane brought into place, so you can store them right on site now and put them in place. But at some point, you may have to relocate those upland. And then coordinate with Maine DOT. We've talked a little bit about this with Rich, and he's going to share some plans for Steamboat Wharf Lane with us. The DOT has made some improvements to their storm drainage outfalls along Main Street, but what they do ultimately does impact, especially with surface runoff and stormwater handling from rainfall events. What they do on Main Street potentially can impact the waterfront as well. So we want to make sure whatever you guys are investing in, if you're putting in a seawall to elevate protection down at the waterfront, that is coordinated with their outfalls that would ultimately go through that. Also, again, there's going to be some coordination with private property owners, not only for widening the walkway, but there's also an opportunity potentially at 26 Main Street, which the town is talking with that owner. That's where there's a point of land that they have, and the walkway is pretty tight right along the water's edge in that point, and is susceptible to tidal erosion quite often. So there's an opportunity there to maybe move the walkway upland a little bit, and we'll show a location for that here. And then opportunities to start. I know you guys have been talking about it for a while, and it may take a while, but acquiring the railroad tracks down on the west end as well too, that haven't been used for a long time. There's an opportunity there if you want to do the parking and some of the park space improvements. That's a lot of real estate that could provide benefit in that area. So not a very complex solution yet, but here's what this typically looks like. You have your mean high water level kind of way down your embankment. Even with the 2050 commit to manage levels for sea level rise, you're still well clear of where your walkway is. This walkway that's shown this 10 feet wide is generally recommended to follow your existing walkway, which is 4 feet wide, so it's just getting wider, but it is in that same location relationship. You have this kind of teal blue area, or blue-green. That's where your 100-year effective FEMA flood level is now, and that's about what you experienced last winter. So there was some overtopping around your town pier and some of your low-lying areas in the parking lot, on the order of 6 inches or so, or maybe a foot of water in some areas. And then the commit to manage level for sea level rise is this kind of green area. So it's going up, I think, at 1.8 feet or 1.5. So a little higher, but we still think most of your waterfront could withstand that with some adaptability of paving the walkway, and that your shorefront is still pretty stable with a relatively static level of inundation, and that's not impacting a lot of your buildings in the upland area yet. And then this is the prepare to manage level that the state asks you to look at. You're only required to plan for the commit to manage level, but while you're at it, if there's a reason to look at that prepare to manage level, we look at that too. But again, this doesn't show all the way to the upland areas. We don't think that's a significant factor by 2050 for how most of your waterfront operates. We've seen these plan views before, and those represent, again, some of those different shading scenarios. Then about 6 inches or so a foot, a lot of this first section from Steamboat Wharf to the town pier along that top of that waterfront could potentially flood during a 100-year storm event. And then with that commit to manage sea level rise on top of that, until you get to the gazebo, most of this area is still just the railroad tracks that are flooding. Again, so visually, I'm trying to point to it on the plan, we're just shy of these buildings back here, but your flooding could basically just come over the railroad tracks and die into the existing embankment in this area. And then similar in the other direction, and you don't have any buildings to protect from that stretch down to the gazebo. So most of this area we feel is pretty stable, with the exception of wanting to pave the walkway versus those unit pavers. Guess this is probably one of the areas that's more complex between the town pier and the hotel just before it goes upland towards the town office. You have your town pier and associated parking, a gazebo, the public restroom, the history museum building. You have your harbor master's office and the marina, and then you have some fuel tanks, and you have some park space as well. Those again, that kind of bluish green level there represents flooding like you had last winter, which it's an area that flooded. It was on the order of a few inches in most places to maybe up to a foot, where some of those seasonal floats are stored and floated in that area. I believe it was that more over here.
It was at the
Town dock.
It was at the town.
Yep.
So again, the walkway would stay in place where it is, be 10 feet wide. And some of the buildings that we show, although they held up to flooding, like the gazebo, for example, is in that flood zone. It still has some stairs to get up to the top of the gazebo. So we don't feel that those are at significant risk by 2050. And then that section terminates as we start to head uphill here towards the town office, just past the Fort Knox Inn. Just looking back at the waterfront, you see a lot of buildings in this area that are fairly close to the walkway and fairly close to that flood zone, and then you have your marina and then the town pier just off in the background you can't see, and then this park space. And a closer look at grade, the lower level of a building like that restroom is pretty close to being susceptible to flooding. And so we do recommend in the long-term horizon, which we'll talk about next, by 2100, either relocating or elevating some of these structures or building a wall to protect them in a tight space like this. And again, the town dock, which was pretty much right up the flooding level to the town pier, and we were working on actually another study with GEI for a redesign of that structure, so there may be an opportunity to elevate that in the meantime. It could temporarily have access issues along the approach during a flood event, but for the most part it would be accessible, and that area is pretty resilient with the pavement and the armored shoreline to hold up to that static flooding. The next stretch is from that Fort Knox Park Inn all the way, continuing almost to the pedestrian bridge at the Veterans Memorial. Again, there's a lot of elevation in this area, so I think for the most part the shoreline and the walkway are pretty safe. Widening the walkway to 10 feet in width will require some level of cutting into the embankment in some areas, or some additional fill, which might steepen up some of the lawn space in particular where you can't widen the walkway into your parking lot here at the town office. And then here's that area we talked about where the town is starting to work on discussions with private property owners about relocating the walkway further upland versus this exposed point of land. This is the area where that relocation of the walkway looks like. It'd probably come around the corner, kind of angle towards the flagpole and then back, but not be right out at the end of the peninsula. And you can see that grade elevation going uphill here towards the town office, where The walkway is pretty safe, but if you were to widen it 10 feet up in that area, you'd be chasing the grade a little bit downhill, or we may be impacting the parking lot. So those are design details that would happen during next phase after this conceptual planning is completed. Then the last area is the area where there's the pedestrian bridge and a stream coming out from under Main Street, the Veterans Memorial, and the area with the park and parking lot space. The underpass under the Route 1 bridge, the Verona Bridge, and then this final stretch was kind of on a steep embankment behind the Irving Circle K building back up to Main Street. There are some areas, and the design details will come at a further date when you advance the improvements, but conceptually we think with some level of reconfiguring a guardrail like this, or the fence to widen a 4-foot walkway to 10 feet is still doable, but it is going to be a little bit of a site detail challenge in some areas. This is an area where you have a 4-foot wide walkway. You can see a significant level of erosion occurring in this area, and you have that retaining wall already just to accommodate a 4-foot walkway on the steep slide slope. So going to 10 feet, at least initially, if you were to invest in that at grade, you'd be pushing a ways back into the embankment. You're really not allowed to encroach much out further over the river. So this is an area that, even though most of the walkway we're recommending initially keeping at grade, you might start with elevating it up in this area 5 or 6 feet or so that it's easier to fill and tie back into the embankment. It's that underpass area, and we do know that there's an outfall for drainage from the bridge that kind of discharges on it, but it also erodes in general from the river inundation right along the edge. This example, this is what's Route 196, and you might have that wrong, in Lisbon, in the Androscoggin River, and what they have is a really solid concrete walkway. It's part of an overall regional paved walkway system, and you have more of a concrete scour protection wall associated with that on the outside. And it's known that you have limited height restrictions underneath the bridge like you guys do, so you really can only elevate it so much in this area. But a more durable armored walkway like this will at least hold up and allow for that inundation of the flooding to come over it without having to reset those pavers. And we feel that paving just with asphalt in this area and then the rock below would not necessarily hold up as well to the inundation, that the edge of that pavement would probably unravel as well in such an exposed area. So we would recommend something like this. Again, just looking back at the town's fish pier and the main waters utility building, public restroom, and then the parking lot and park space. Again, we think an at-grade walkway would be fine through this area. We did want to ask, and maybe we can talk about it tonight as well in detail, talk about widening, or a goal to widen the path to 10 feet for vehicular maintenance, for access for plowing or snow blowing equipment. The bottleneck would be that bridge potentially, so you'd either need a turnaround down just before it to go all the way back out to the town office, and then you could access the other side just fine from the Veterans Memorial area, or you'd look at replacing that bridge with a 10-foot wide or so bridge. So that's something to think about a little bit. If you're going to make that investment in widening the bridge, you'd also probably want to elevate it and plan for a level of sea level rises. You'd hope a structure like that would last 75 years or so. So that would be an item that we'll talk about in the report, about some of the pros and cons of doing that, and give you some costs for widening it to 10 feet versus keeping it at 4 feet and knowing you'd have to turn your vehicles around for maintenance. That 2050 to 2100 in the planning horizon, we're not only looking at now widening the walkway 10 feet, but also elevating it to elevation 16. We talked about the variation in elevation throughout the walkway. Most of it is down around elevation 11, around your marina, down near Steamboat Wharf Lane, and also up at the Veterans Memorial. So you're looking at about a 5-foot elevation of the walkway to make it more resilient to that commit to managed level, including sea level rise out through 2100. And one of the ways we're looking at doing that is exploring options with either a levee, where you're elevating the embankment armoring, and a levee is an earthen berm, which then comes back down behind it where it needs to, where you're constricted by buildings, things like that at the back of it, or would just be a fill structure that would tie back into the embankment. There are some areas, like around the marina or the town parking lot we'll talk about, where you would have a vertical wall built in excuse me, incorporated with that levee, so that maybe get some water. Yes, I talk quietly, but I don't usually use my voice. Told you might have to talk, John.
Second string.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So in those areas where you have that vertical wall and you have a shorter area to protect with encroaching buildings or parking or other facilities nearby, you can't just fill into the upland grade. We would recommend putting in a sheet pile wall in the middle of it. I'll show an example from another project we're looking at doing that for. It does a couple things. Again, if you were to lose, you had some wave energy or more significant river flow, and you were to lose some of your rock in front of that wall, the wall is in place. So it's kind of a redundancy, but an extra fail-safe in case your embankment does erode during a storm. It also allows you to maintain some of your at-grade structure or not have to fill up against an existing building nearby, which would then require that building to need to be elevated potentially or relocated. One of the downsides, I guess, to doing that vertical wall is you are creating a bathtub then behind the wall or levee system, and you do need to have some stormwater pumps in place in case you have a significant rainfall event like we typically do with storms, so that stormwater coming downhill doesn't build up behind the wall and start to flood the structures behind it. Again, is then a recommendation once you've acquired some of the property, hopefully from the railroad and or worked with the private property owners for a portion of Steamboat Wharf Lane to start working on park and parking space down on that end. At this point, you'd also want to you start the conversation sooner, but if you're going to make some of these investments, you could consider them in terms of that levee wall system or elevating buildings or utility structures to allow them to be adaptable again during those periodic flood events. We still don't think daily flooding is going to be an issue with mean high water, fortunately, even under worst case scenarios in the future. So it's just going to be a pros and cons type of prioritization discussion with the town on whether you want to start relocating structures or build a levee system to armor and protect them. Yep, sorry, that does cover that. Thank you. So here's an example of what that combination of building an earthen berm or increased up to the commit to manage base flood elevation plus a walkway above that in combination with a sheet pile wall. This would be an area we'll talk about like where you have parking immediately behind it or a building that's close by and you can't just fill right up to it. Some of them, this berm will continue over and come back down to grade or continue at grade or at the proposed grade back into the embankment. Some of the reasons we would recommend doing that at this point, fortunately, where you guys were at was not as bad as it was for a lot of the riverine communities in Maine. The picture on the left is from Damascotta. We designed this restroom building for them in their downtown along the Damascotta River, and they were fairly proactive with their ordinance at the time. The minimum requirement was the base flood elevation plus a foot for your first floor elevation, and their ordinance is base flood elevation plus 3 feet. Which you're typically required to protect for critical infrastructure like wastewater treatment facilities. And that picture from last January storms represents 4 feet of water in their parking lot. And if they had built that to BFE plus 3 feet, they'd have a couple feet of water in their new restroom building. So again, if you're going to make some of these investments in your downtown and they're going to cost a significant amount of funding, then we recommend that you be conservative in your approach. This does not account for some of the future sea level rise scenarios that are predicted. So they are looking at a similar effort like we are looking at here with a levee or kind of wall system around the perimeter of the parking lot in addition to elevating structures. This was downtown in Portland where I-295 going through there effectively operates as a berm or berm and levee system from the back cove. And then the lower marginal way neighborhood has stuff like this happen every once in a while during an intense thunderstorm. So this was not a 100-year flood event. This was a lot of stormwater coming down the hill from Portland, hitting all that pavement, and then having a few feet of water that folks had to drive through as the high tide was up, and the water couldn't just discharge out naturally. So they are working they've been working for a few years on a subsurface storage system to deal with this. So something like that, if you're going to build a levee or berm and can't fill back in the existing grade, you're creating a bathtub that you need to deal with this scenario as well. This project is in Machias. It's a little bit advanced ahead of Bucksports, but not too far. We went through the conceptual planning. This, again, similar to the typical section we just showed, but it's an area where we merged it in to show what it would look like where the wall would be exposed in areas where you have parking coming right up to it and where you wouldn't want to fill right up against the backs of some of these buildings. And then you have that kind of earthen berm, you have the walkway and the levee system in front of it. And if all this were to get wiped out and due to coastal erosion and flooding along the river, you still have this sheet pile wall and a concrete cap, which you can also add on to in case so you commit to manage at a certain level. And if sea level rise does get worse over time, you could add on to it. But you've already invested a lot of money in the base infrastructure. And then that adaptation is relatively easy. This first stretch from Steamboat Wharf Lane again to the gazebo, we're recommending just an earthen berm that is filled all the way back into existing grade. This is pretty close to coming up to the bottoms of some of these buildings, so there may be some coordination needed to tie in grades there. We also have heard that DOT has been working with the town on some access improvements and regrading of Steamboat Wharf Lane, so we'll want to make sure that that's coordinated as well. This area is the area we are considering for also proposed parking and park space options as requested. It would be great if you can do it on adjacent private property next door along Steamboat Wharf Lane. That's an area that we'd recommend you consider for further coordination. It will definitely help with opportunities to tie back into existing upland grade, because it is challenging to end a wall anywhere in here along Steamboat Wharf Lane without impacting access to those buildings. And again, with these higher level scenarios, you might be filling right up against some of the lower levels of these buildings, and you're either kind of grading back down and dealing with stormwater behind your levee, or potentially coordinating with some of these folks to abandon or elevate or do some other flood measures to protect the lower level of that building. The other direction, it's a little bit easier until we get back to the gazebo, with just fill across the railroad tracks and into the upland grade to protect this area, and you don't need that sheet pile wall. This is probably the area, again, that's most complex, like we talked about originally for the 2050 planning. The red line represents where we would have a levee system with that wall built in, tying it into existing grades, so you're protecting the gazebo, and some of your upland buildings, and your restroom. An alternative as well too, and we'll provide different costs for doing kind of the red recommended baseline wall, if you will, and then some of these alternate locations if you wanted to extend a wall or levee system around your harbor master's building or the pier, versus potentially just elevating some of those structures and leaving those areas susceptible or adaptable, if you will, to periodic flooding. So there's a cost-benefit analysis. Is it worth it to try and protect erosion of this park space? That's kind of a community value that will provide some cost options for alternate locations of a levee system to protect those. And then that wall system with the walkway and levee ends just a little bit past the Fort Knox Park. As you start to go uphill towards the town office. Again, this is an area I talked about it before, but I can illustrate this walkway is about 4 feet wide. If you're going to make it 6 feet wide or twice as wide, you might be able to gain a foot or two with a guardrail towards the parking lot, but you're going out 4 or 5 feet further out this way towards the river. So there'll be some level of regrading done on the embankment as well to make this walkway wider. Again, if you're looking back at the marina area, you can see a lot of the buildings in this area are fairly close to the walkway. So the opportunities to elevate this area about 5 feet and then tie back into grade are fairly limited, and you have an access drive coming down as well too. So a lot of this area we think will be the elevated walkway with stabilized embankment in front of it, and then a vertical wall right behind it. And then you'll have to deal with this trapped stormwater in the space behind the wall. And similar thing, you have an elevated walkway and a wall right behind it so that you could potentially keep a building like that in place, or you could consider relocating or elevating some of these buildings. So we'll present both of those options and pros and cons and costs associated with them in the final report. And same thing with the town pier, that is being redesigned, and it's being redesigned the way that if you did want to elevate it in the future, that's an option. With the access drive, excuse me again. And most of your shorefront is pretty stable to the level of flooding that you saw this past winter. So we do suspect that if you wanted to just protect some of the buildings and upland parking, you would run that berm, an elevated levee around the parking lot, and consider, just elevating the pier, but allowing that access drive to be temporarily inaccessible during flood events. From the Fort Knox Park Inn all the way almost or to the bridge at the Veterans Park, the elevation is such that we don't think, again, you'll need to do an elevated earthen berm or wall system in most of this area, including if you can work on getting the walkway further away from the point. And we did talk about this. Some of this will be elevated a little bit, but it can tie directly back into the embankment, so we don't think you'll need to do a sheet pile wall in addition to just elevating the walkway in this area. Really same thing for this picture. And again, as you get towards the Veterans Memorial area, we would recommend that you do a sheet pile wall, an elevated walkway that actually goes up a ways up the river. We did hear this last winter that you had some overflowing coming out of the stream that came close to flooding the restrooms. So we recommend that you invest in protecting that entire area with the wall system that ties into the side of the Route 1 bridge approach. The understanding that you really can't do too much underneath the bridge other than just make that surface more stable and resilient to flooding. And then as you ramp back up, you're talking about a 10-foot wide walkway, and this is that stretch that if you are going to fix that in the near term here, we'd recommend that you also elevate it as well so that you don't have to build it now and significantly cut back into that embankment. You'd elevate it and be able to tie into the embankment a lot easier. Yeah, same thing, that is a redundant picture, but you do have some width and access issues at the top for a 10-foot wide walkway where you'd have to relocate that guardrail that we would coordinate. Yeah, you guys have seen these, so I won't go over those again. The same type of issues, the same resilient but at grade and flooding walkway. All right, so I know that was a mouthful. Thank you all for your input. That's guided us along the way and helped us as we have some experience with other projects or other planning efforts around the state that we think are applicable here as well. I'd like to open it up at this point to questions or comments from the public. And I guess if you want to talk, maybe come up to the microphone.
And anyone watching from home can email me at rich.rotella@bucksportmaine.gov, or you can call the number that I provided at the beginning of this meeting, which is 207-307-8030. I guess I'll start the question. So if we were to change from the brick to asphalt, do we have to take the bricks up?
We typically recommend it. I have seen projects where you do pave directly over them. I think your base is probably good, your sand and gravel beneath it, but given how inconsistent some of those are, you might want to invest in taking those up.
A cement walkway that you recommend by the bridge area where you can't really raise it. You have kind connections and pads that are poured and they're kept separated, will there be any like unleveling over the years from ice, or how do you stop that from happening? I know we had a heck of a trouble on Main Street with the cement walkways. People complaining that they were tripping over them when they, you know, because of the fall, the winter and ice and.
Yes, so yeah, over time they can heave depending on the quality of construction. That has come a long ways. So like that Lisbon one has not experienced that over I think the past decade or so that I've seen it there. But I have seen whether it's tree roots or frost heaving and stuff like that, panels along the concrete walkway.
Are they tied in with each other even though they're kind of separated? Are they tied in so they try not to do that, or?
They can be, and I have our structural engineer here, maybe.
Okay.
is a
I
little
just
more
think it
expert,
would
but a lot of those
happen
can be a reinforced mesh or a rebar type, system, so it's.
Yeah, I would just think it would happen more on the walkway right by the water, where it's always got that wetness and then we still do have some pretty cold days in the winter, so.
Yeah, I would say reinforce it and put a lot of joints in it. But yeah, I think it can be designed to withstand that.
Okay.
And then as far as if it's tied into or not, I'm not familiar with really the abutment or the dimensions of that, but designing something to tie in with that, I mean, we would just measure it and see what's out there and see what makes sense as far as like the best solution. Tying into it or having like a separate soil layer between it or.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think we'd likely have it, because most of it's riprap out there for their abutment, and then you have that unit paper kind of block,
Yeah.
block wall. So we might be putting a footing that is down below that frost protection level to support the wall as well, too.
There's a lot of people that would love to use that walkway in the winter.
Yeah. And the alternate is not as ideal, is that you go up the access drive to Main Street.
Right.
This is just a challenging area that
Yep.
has a lot of issues, and in the short term, you may look at alternate routes until you can find the right solution there.
There is an opportunity if our new dock facility, which we have money for, but if ever gets finished, because we've been waiting a long time, that'll be open year round. So there's a chance to have more people down and around that area in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Do you know the width of your sidewalk plow?
It's 4 feet now,
It's 4 feet now.
only because we had to have that size to accommodate the narrow walkways we already had.
So, the basic idea here is we're going to take out all of the existing brickwork. We're going to put a new underlay in there, raise things up, new underlay, and we bring in more big rock towards the Penobscot, elevate it all up, and whether we pave it or concrete from here to there. So with all that,
In the long term, at the elevation is in the long term, and the short term is just paving at grade the walkway,
okay.
replacing with bricks.
Now does not include the $9-10 million for going down Main Street, this is separate. So where are we in terms of just a ballpark budget time frame to accomplish what we've just seen?
We've
in-
not worked all that out in detail. I will say that as a rough guesstimate, just repaving that walkway at this point, replacing with bricks, might be on the order of $2 million to do the entire.
I'm sorry.
$2 million to
Couple
just
million
repave the
dollars,
entire
okay.
walkway. When you
But
start.
then we also, back to Mike's point, we end up with your idea is to end up with a 10-foot wide walkway that now we have vehicles that could snow blow and make it a year-round access and,
Yeah, a little bit more multi-use, so people on a stroller while somebody's jogging as well too. We
Okay.
didn't really talk about that, but yeah,
Okay.
more users could get on it.
okay.
But the longer term, and we'll give more refined cost estimates here, but we wanted to get some feedback on these concepts. Cost is a very important factor in feasibility, but you are starting to talk more tens of millions of dollars, if not more, for, an earthen levee and seawall or relocating buildings can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. So all those pieces add up for longer
So there's
term.
no, at this, we'll call it phase one, there's no adding on to the existing seawall for,
We don't think you need to. It would
Okay.
mostly be kind of weathering like the site did a lot, last year's kind of somewhat historic flood event. And most of it did pretty well, with the exception of the pavers. A lot of those were damaged.
Do we think we could get away with a 6-foot wide walkway because the equipment we use to snow blow the sidewalks is about 4 foot, and going 6 foot still allows for 2 wheelchairs to pass through each other simultaneously? Would that work to help alleviate some of that heartburn with the cost?
It certainly could, and we can still present what a 10-foot wide walkway versus a 6-foot wide walkway would cost, so you guys have that for consideration. A multi-use walkway, if you will, for people to be able to more comfortably jog, or a little kid to ride a bike along while people are walking or in strollers. That minimum width is typically 8 feet, and the ideal width is really 12. So if that was a desire, that's why we recommend about a 10-foot wide width, as well as you could get it's about the average width of a private residential driveway, so you could get a pickup truck with a plow on it if you want to maintain it that way, or emergency services if need be. But 6 foot is a kind of standard recommended minimum width for snow plowing equipment that's motorized. It's usually 5 feet or so in total width,
Well,
and
that's
it
the
gives you a
standard
little
for
wiggle
a
room.
sidewalk in general,
Yeah.
is 6 feet now.
So we can look at that. Or do you think there's it's a matter of cost, or do you think there's no interest in a 10-foot wide walkway, or?
Oh, it'd be nice to see both,
Okay.
because we have a lot of multi-million-dollar projects, and our population hasn't exploded, nor has our tax base. So to provide alternatives, because something like the Steamboat Wharf, as I was speaking to earlier, the citizens voted up to 12 million, and the DOT just came through. The project engineering was supposed to be a 50-50 split. It's now a 90-10. So that project's now cut itself down to 9 million, but the public has approved up to 12. So if we work the Steamboat Wharf portion into the main DOT project for bettering the Main Street area, that's where some of your cost that the voters have already approved, it has that
Could apply to that
access.
area,
It can apply potentially to that as well.
Okay, great.
Just a quick question. The bridge is how wide? The walking bridge, do you?
4 feet.
It is
I think
only
it's-
4?
That's the structure, maybe 5 or 6 or so, but the clear width for walking is,
So even if it needs to be 6, the bridge is still, the
Or-
walking bridge
or
on
you
there would still
shovel
be a
that,
problem.
or however you maintain it now, and you just, use your sidewalk plow. If you kept it at the same width, it would be a stopping point. You'd have to turn around with your equipment and head back.
I don't know, I can't picture how you turn it. Do you have any ideas on how that would work?
It would be a struggle.
Yeah,
With a sidewalk plow, it'd be easier than a truck.
Yeah.
right. And you said that's 4 feet?
now?
The actual space in between the rails is 4 feet of walkable space now.
And,
On
and your
the
plow
bridge
is 4.
is 4 feet, so it would be,
Scraping.
Yeah. And your son just painted the rails.
So we'll shovel that.
Yeah.
But I wasn't even sure if there was trying to picture in my mind, I cannot see any space for turning or
for a
maneuvering.
turnaround, it would be,
Well, where that big wall is, I think there's a
There's some
sewer area right up there as well. So
On one of the slides, it referenced 26 Main Street.
Hmm?
What's located at 26 Main Street? What jumps off the page?
that was Hoffman Insurance.
Hoffman's.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the picture with the white fence,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
Jay and I have had
Yeah,
some
yeah.
discussions with her, and I think this plan compared to the previous plan has the walkway in this plan more where she would like it. The original plan called for it to go straight through, and her fear was for the residents that walkway really encroaches closer to the building. So adding a little arc to it, but Jay and I did speak to her about that we may need to start straight and then can bend towards the flagpole. That way we can have an ADA. If we're not going to elevate the walkway in that section, we can have an ADA ramp the pavement up to the existing land, and we would not lessen her. We'd leave the walkway go straight through and be at that height, because we did recognize a lot of storm debris on that property up to the flagpole. So it already is encroaching onto that property.
Yeah, that's a good point. So there is a low retaining wall there, and we can maybe go back picture-wise. That does illustrate well. Sorry for, oops, I'm going to slides from the previous presentation.
Right there.
Yeah, so there's a fence, but there's about a 2 foot or so, 18-inch high retaining wall. And that, with this walkway, is again at that grade level 11. And you had almost 2 feet of flooding with this last winter storm over that, because it got up in our lawn space. And most of the area held up pretty well. Again, there were pavers that were dislodged and eroded, but we feel like your shorefront is pretty capable currently to withstand a relatively historic flood event like that with a couple feet of water in downtown. But beyond that, when you start planning towards 2100 and you're looking at 3 or 4 or 5 feet above that of water, that's where that walkway would come up 5 feet. And we think some of your buildings and other infrastructure would not withstand that level of sea level rise.
One thing our town council has been discussing, and Larry Walls here from the Historical Society, is that other red building, not the bathroom one, but the one that sits a little bit further. So during those storms, the water got right close to the building, but the building's elevated and sits on some posts in there. So, and I know we've seen it, and I just can't. What's the recommendation for there?
For what happened like last winter is leaving things at grade with the walkway, but when you do start looking out beyond 2050 and more significant sea level rise, that's where this area would have that earthen berm and elevating that walkway up about 5 feet, but it would probably have that vertical wall immediately behind it. Otherwise, if you were to fill behind it, you'd have to look at elevating a building like that or relocating it.
This is mostly FYI. My name's Larry Wall, I'm a member of the Historical Society. We have a couple proposals out there to move that building up on an 8-foot foundation up towards Main Street. But there's another proposal that is to put a foundation underneath where it is. Maybe raise it in a foot and put in a concrete foundation. Right now it sits on cement blocks. The reason this all came about initially was we've had moisture problems affecting our artifacts. But with this climate change and what you folks are talking about, it's another good reason to either move the building or elevate the building on the foundation.
Yeah,
Or a frost wall.
Yeah, if you're thinking about elevating it, and the Damerscott project was one example, but the bare minimum that you'd be required to elevate it is that base flood elevation plus a foot for your finished floor. But if you can afford it and you can start looking out longer term, then we'd recommend you look at elevating it 2 or 3 feet or some further sea level rise recommended scenarios. If you're going to go through the effort, an extra foot or so of concrete or 2. I think it's worth it for peace of mind with that potential future risk. Great, thank you. Do you guys have a timeline for when you anticipate doing that? be.
Not really.
Yeah.
It would be good, you know, in the next couple of years, 2 to 3,
Great.
nothing firm right
And it's the belief of 2050 to 2100 that the smaller red building, which is our utility room and bathrooms, that be relocated.
Yes, or that wall put in
raised.
front of it.
Yeah.
Or raised. Raising some of those buildings provides challenges. That restroom, again, the example on Damascata for raising that building 4 feet above the parking lot meant a fairly significant access ramp to get up into it. So there were some pros and cons to if you build a wall and you take that area effectively out of the flood zone, then you don't have to have the building elevated and those ramps put in. Would be curious, I mean, we can ask some questions back as well, too. And thank you all for your input, it's great. Mike, with the Harbor Masters building, or with the town pier, be curious to hear some, and we'll talk with the committee about this going forward, some of the thoughts for, you know, extending a levee or wall system around those peninsulas versus elevating some of those structures and.
I prefer elevation myself. When the floods came in last January, the highest one went around the Marina building. But the Marina building is on piles, so it was up high, and it didn't, there's 4 steps up to get into the level floor, and it came up to the first step, which is, you know, about 7 inches. So that's the highest. I've seen it since 1991 when we had that hurricane, and they were about equally height. But of course, the marina wasn't there then, so it was just, the only way I could judge that was the level on the parking lot at the town dock. The level the water came up on that. I don't, the walls, to me, would I don't know, take away from the look of it, you know, and I would, in the few times that we've ever had issues, you know, the marina building on the piles seems fine, and if we had to put it a little higher, we could. I mean, that's not a huge deal.
Yeah, it's a lower cost than
Yeah.
putting a wall around it. That was one
Right.
thing I didn't, and I'm glad you mentioned that. You know, elevating your walkway and with a levee or wall system 5 or 6 feet does have some visual impact. So, you know, folks in those lawn areas or lower.
It makes you
floor
finally
buildings
like you're in a
can't-
prison.
Can't see the water anymore. So
The only other problem I have is on the water itself, the piles that I have. I want to make sure that they are tall enough so if a storm happened during the period of time that the floats are actually out on the water, that they cannot float over the top of the piles. Because if they did, it would be a disaster. So, and our piles currently are high. I've marked the highest water on the dolphins that are on the big dock. And my piles in the marina, one set is not really high, and that concerns me a little bit. But that can be adjusted. Just drive another pile right in front of it and make it taller.
do you know when those were installed? Or
The first set was installed in 2017, and the second set was installed 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
So not too old. So they don't need
Yeah.
that life cycle wise. They don't need.
Oh no, they're fine. You know, they actually used heartwood for the main pile, and then pressure treated for the other ones. And the heartwood, you can't drive a nail in that stuff. It's so tough. So
But you might need new ones that are higher.
I might need a new one of those. Yeah. The on the first set we had driven, the first year it was in, we had a pretty good ice winter, and it pushed the whole dolphin over and tilted it, you know, 15 degrees or whatever. And it's never moved since. It's still there like that. It works fine. We put a long enough chain around it so it doesn't affect it. But it isn't very tall. When we have the real high tides, we're not very far from the top of it. So
Great. That's excellent. It's good to know.
So, your question also asked about, or you mentioned about the tanks.
Yes.
They're not gonna move, right?
No, but they are at risk of, similar to that 6 inches or 7 inches or like a foot over the town pier.
Well,
They
the
are on a pad.
the
so-
wells were flooded.
Yeah.
You know, where the pipes go underground, both those wells were flooded, and they had to be pumped out. We pumped them out, and of course they were flooded with salt water, so you had to, and they were cleaned this spring and everything afterwards. The tanks themselves, I keep them full in the winter, and I can't imagine them ever lifting off the pads that are there, but maybe you know better than I do. I don't know. They're 2,000-gallon tanks, double-walled. They're heavy, so.
They make concrete floats that float as well.
Well,
too,
if they were
so-
empty, they might float. But if they're full of fuel, that's, I don't know, that's kind of a different story, I think. But,
It's a good point. I guess, and our question would be more, if you did have to do something, would it be preferred, is it okay if they're out of service or not accessible, basically, for a day or two around a flood event?
oh, heck yes.
If you just had to elevate the concrete pad versus building a wall around it.
Or what about, they're not actually tied into the pad, they just sit on it.
So, yeah.
So if they were actually bolted to the pad, would that be better? I mean, like our piers are actually tied into the piles with straps and bolts. That's why they didn't lift when they got flooded.
Mm-hmm.
And if we did the same thing with tanks, I mean, I would think that would be the cheapest way out
Yeah.
to make it safe.
Yeah,
So-
they can be, and it's great that you keep them full, but there is, human error happens, or they.
Oh, yeah.
So they would be a floatable risk potentially at some point, or then, if they did float and they weren't pinned
Yep.
or anchored, then they could hit your building or, something else.
Yep.
So, but yes, yeah, we can bolt, those can be bolted down.
Yeah. My pump actually did get water right up to the bottom of it. The actual gas pump up on top. So and there was water at the pump. So there again, it's got a manhole underneath it, and I had to pump that out.
And are you familiar with where he's talking about?
Yes, I believe so.
Oh, okay.
And you can flood-proof, if you wanted to going forward, those wells or those subsurface structures, you can put flood-proof hatches
Mhm.
on those, so.
Yep.
You can pump them out as well, too.
Well, if they get any water in them, the alarm goes off. So
Yeah.
there's supposed to be any water or fuel gets in them, and it'll set the alarm off.
And that's monitored yearly by, help me, who's the company that does that? GAF.
GAFTech.
Yeah.
They come out yearly, and he completely cleaned all the manholes out, vacuumed them, washed them, so they were all good, taken care of this last spring, so, yep.
These details are very helpful, and I should say, we didn't talk about site lighting or electrical services. There was a wish, or, benches or flagpoles. There were a wish list of items for improvement, and we will talk about those in our report. If you're going to make improvements, or, with the levee system, there are a lot of little pieces along the way that you'd probably also want to upgrade. We also didn't talk about the sewer department's stuff, but, whether they flood-proof their manholes or not in the future is typically recommended so that your wastewater treatment plant isn't treating a bunch of salt water, or having to clean out its tanks, and, which are a lot larger than your fuel
Right, yeah.
tanks, so. But those are all items that we'll touch on in the report as well. I just didn't talk about those in detail tonight.
I've got to agree with Mike on how this whole thing would look. Changing the visibility. But also creating a pond. I just can't picture that. If you have a good rainstorm, like you mentioned, coming down through there and creating a pond.
Yeah, that's where you need those stormwater pumps.
Yeah,
And you also need it to be somewhat human error proof, so you need to kind of have a separate generator and fuel for the generators that's offline, so that if you lose power, which often happens during storm events, you don't need human intervention to be down there in a really risky situation, and the pumps could, operate on their own. But you're right, it is a visual
It's a
impact. That's why we're gonna
challenge,
try and, we'll show that typical section, but we'll try and show a few of these images updated with some of the improvements recommended, because it is gonna be a pros and cons kind of decision in terms of, if you don't do something like that, then you're potentially going to lose some of your structures on your waterfront, and what's more value in the long run, protecting those or maintaining views, even if more higher levels of flooding can continue to occur.
Kind of a fine line.
I'm really stuck on the this width of the path. Does it ever happen that you have a main area that's a certain, like, say, wider width, and then you could mix and match other areas or of a more narrow, thinking like down where under the bridge in those areas, or do you advise keeping one width the whole way?
It can vary. There's some minimum ADA accessibility standards for widths, which are a lot less even than your a little bit less than your 4 foot width now. It's 32 inches. And then you're supposed to have wider bump outs for passing areas. So if you really had to go to a minimum width, every so many couple hundred feet, you need to have some bump outs for that. There's also minimum widths that we recommend as you heard, in terms of public works equipment. But there certainly could be reasons why, like maybe it stays 6 feet wide on the Irving state side of things, for example,
Yeah.
because the impacts cutting into the hillside or elevating in there would be challenging with a 10-foot width. And that's a clear point, where if you're intuitively using the pathway, you would treat that as a separate width and a separate approach under the bridge, and then, it might get wider down on the west end where you have the railroad tracks and more real estate and things feel more open. So that's excellent question. That's something we could consider as well. The reason you try and keep it consistent in the same width is, when there's a lot of snow on it, it's
Right.
easy to understand where the walkway is, for example, or if you're biking along or running, and all of a sudden the width switches on you and it's not intuitive, you can have a little bit of conflict, but there can be some very good reasons why we might do variable widths.
Yeah, okay. Because I was thinking, if you were looking at it even in terms of the cost, if you could see what sections cost a certain amount based on the width, if you could
Yes.
like sort of mix and match.
Yeah, not only will we give you comparisons in terms of 10-foot width versus 6 foot, but we will also talk about improvement areas like the 4 areas that we talked about that I think have some distinct differences. The Steamboat Wharf to the gazebo to the Fort Knox Park Inn, basically to the Veterans Memorial, and then from there up to Main Street. Great, thank you.
That footbridge, that's got a wooden
Wooden deck.
wooden deck. Could you not, probably, question, rework that bridge right in place, like 2 wings on either side?
I'm not familiar with the existing framing, but I think anything's possible. Yeah. So,
I think that'd be
It would
most
take some,
cost-effective.
we'd have to look at the original design, and the structural.
how old is
Design
that
elements.
bridge? Do you guys know?
I do. I have the plans in my office, I believe.
It's probably about 20 years old or more.
More. Not much
Not
more.
much
Not much
more.
more. Maybe
No.
2003, maybe 21.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not much, but I believe I have the plans.
Certainly
So
could.
when the original
Yeah.
walkway went in.
It was 20 years old.
When that section of the walkway went in, yes, because the walkway itself was built in phases, and that would have been the last phase, if I'm not mistaken. And the engineering firm was, we use his son now,
Pine Tree, was it?
Pine Tree,
Yeah.
Pine Tree Engineering, yeah. And I believe I have those documents.
Mhm.
Oh, that's a good
Just
idea.
a thought.
Yeah, it's a good thought.
So, we're seeking alternate funding for electrical and water upgrades for the new town dock project. which is in the works, and we're expecting answers soon. Would you expect any other of those upgrades any further along the walkway, or what do you think? So, the bathroom building. Each EV charger is 40 amp. So that's 80, right? And then, of course, to run the bathroom is 20, is 100. And then everything else in there. If both EV chargers are going, we blow a fuse. So, and I'm not quite sure what else goes off of that. I think the lights in that area come off of that same pole, and we have 50 amp for the Bay Festival when we plug in for big electricals for food trucks and stuff. Is there anywhere else on there that you would recommend electrical upgrades? And if we do a water upgrade there, should we do it anywhere else? As in, I think we're talking hydrants for water.
Talking at least a 2-inch line for the town dock, and probably 600-800 amps.
So a little bit of a back and forth in terms of our coastal resiliency study and master plan. We have a general recommendation that any improvements to the resiliency measures should be coordinated with planned improvements or for utility needs. So we did hear a variety of things like that you would like more electrical service in general for some of your festivities and events versus running some of the power cords out of the town office, or to facilitate those. So on a high level, and if you're going to put a wall through there, you want to make sure you've coordinated your utility services through it. But we, in terms of what those specific projects are and the demands for electric and water, that's not something that I think we can give you a firm answer on.
Okay. And I guess one other thing that I have, in 2016, within my first year of being here, the park where the flagpole is, I call it Flag Point, to the marina, it juts in. And I went to Army Corps of Engineers and DEP about making that green space for the sake of making that green space. And that wasn't good back then. We don't just let you. On the other side though, yeah. So that's the structure.
Steamboat.
Yeah. So not this area where we're looking, but just on the other side of that.
Quite
I don't know if we even have it.
This is the start of it here.
Your
Is it-
overhead view, didn't you have an overhead view?
So it's not this one.
Yes, it's this area right here.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I wanted to put more green space.
Oh, to fill that?
Get to fill, and that was a no. You have to have a legitimate excuse, but is climate change and sea level rise, has that
Generally,
changed
prefer
there?
you retreat, I think,
Yeah.
more than fill into it.
Right.
Unfortunately, there's some trade-off. I think you've had conversations with Maine DEP. Like you have some remnants of historic waterfront structures that are in the intertidal zone, and there's some opportunity to kind of abandon or trade some of those spaces for other areas. But
That's exactly what they told me. We could rebuild what looked like used to be a pier.
so Maine DEP can support that, but Army Corps
Yeah.
may not.
Yeah, and they were both online with that. But my reason for asking that is that area right there and by that hotel, that water goes a quarter of the way up that hill by that hotel. It comes in by their back door. When this floods and it rains,
Shows,
that's a very bad area.
it shows it right up against it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it really does. So when the linemen are staying at the hotel and they're outside, I mean, they're standing on a step, because if they step off that step, they are in water. So my thought was, if you can at least fill that in, riprap maybe with a berm, or with it, to maybe try to help prevent some of that from happening, because there's that little section of land that's available at, I don't know, about 1/3 tide maybe, that you can start to see the remnants right behind the hotel. If you could even go and fill in all the way as much as there, and I know.
I won't say it's impossible. You have to do a fairly thorough alternatives analysis, but they do have fee in lieu of compensation programs for filling and impacting coastal wetlands if there's no other reasonable alternative. And in a tight area like that to protect that building, that might be an option. But if the seawall kind of levee system works and it's above the highest annual tide line, they'd probably prefer that. But it's not 100% no. But yeah, in particular, they would like you to stay above the highest annual tide level.
Better than I got. What about you, Mr. Public Works?
I agree with what you said.
Excellent.
I mean, impact for me in my department is mostly the width of the walkways for maintenance.
And the fact that you would be maintaining it in the winter. That
Well, right, it
you
would
know.
increase
increase your work.
workload, but, yeah.
I'm gonna skip down to the end here as well, too, just so I'm prepared for one last piece. And we'll give the town a PDF file of this, so you can post it on your website as well. Okay. Still leave it open for discussion, but we can also talk about next steps when you guys are ready as well. Are there other questions or thoughts from the public? All right, thank you for the input. We'll summarize, our discussions as well too for your reference. Next steps for, this project is to, update and refine the master plan based on some of the feedback. We'll provide more details about, cost estimates and some of the pros and cons of different options, 6-foot wide path versus 10-foot width, or levee and berm versus elevating buildings, and so on. We'll continue to work on that this fall. I think the plan will be to meet with the waterfront committee early in December, to review that information, and prepare for, a presentation to the town council. I believe Rich has said that the 19th of December might work. It's kind of limited window between holiday periods. If we need to, we could schedule that into January, or so. We just need to ask the state for permission, to extend the schedule. But the state's,
You do that, you're gonna have a new council between December and January, right?
Yeah, but we can always, I mean, the typical council agenda is typically the second and fourth Thursday, but in November and December, due to the holidays both falling the fourth Thursday, a compromise is typically made where it's the third. They can keep saying Wednesday, but it would be the third Thursday. So there's nothing that says we can't ask for another meeting or a special meeting so that we can do this, because I'd really like to stay.
yeah, the
And have this
19th
done.
works for us, I think,
Right.
if it works for you guys.
Yep.
Finish it this year. Yeah.
Yep.
And then the main coastal program would typically like it, finished by, December 31st.
Mm-hmm.
And then by no means are these improvements finished and you've solved everything by that point, but you have a plan in place to consider, for prioritizing some of the options going forward, and continue to discuss, and we'll talk about in our report next steps to, fund further design and permitting, and fund construction, of some of the elements that you'd like to see implemented.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
We'll adjourn this meeting.